On my 68th birthday, I sat at a table set for two and watched the candles bend in on themselves. The cake was from the bakery my husband used to insist on: white frosting, ribbons of lemon, my son's favorite when he was a boy. Across from me, his chair stayed empty long enough to feel personal. Then my phone lit up. Running late? Don't wait up, Mom. That was all. No call, no apology. Just 8 words, neat and bloodless, as if I were a dentist appointment he meant to reschedule. I should have blown out the candles and gone to bed. Instead, I put on my coat and drove downtown that night with that message glowing in my mind. I told myself I wanted air, space. The truth was simpler. Something in me had gone cold. When I stepped into the restaurant foyer, I saw my son before he saw me. He was laughing. His wife sat beside him, hand on his wrist, and across from them was a man in a suit with a folder open on the table. A waiter passed carrying a bottle of wine, and I recognized the label. I had paid for it. Before I tell you what I did next, I need you to understand something. I raised that boy myself after his father died, and I did not raise him to become a stranger across a candlelit table. So if you have ever felt that quiet drop in your stomach when someone you love suddenly looks like someone else, then you already know this story. Tell me where you are watching from, city or country, because I have learned this kind of betrayal does not belong to one place. It travels well. Too well in this world today. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and for 40 years I ran the administrative side of a hospital where mistakes were rarely loud at first. They began as small discrepancies: a missing signature, a charge entered twice, a person smiling while they moved the numbers around. You learn in that kind of work that trouble usually arrives dressed as routine. By the time this happened, I had been a widow for 6 years. My husband, Thomas, had been the steady kind of man. Never theatrical, never careless, and our son David had inherited the best parts of him, or so I believed. David had his father's patience when he was young, his same habit of listening with his whole face. When Thomas died, David held me in the church parking lot and said, "I'm still here, Mom." I built a great deal of trust on that one sentence. When David was 12, the year money was tight and grief was not yet a word we used out loud. I took him to the little French restaurant downtown where Thomas had proposed to me. White tablecloths, brass lamps, waiters who still remembered how to pull out a chair. I told David I did not want to sit at home on my birthday pretending the day meant nothing. So we dressed properly and went together. We kept going every year after that. It became ours in a way only repeated things can. The same corner table if they had it. The same ridiculous little silver butter dish. David rolling his eyes at the violinist and then tipping him anyway. It was never about the menu, although he always ordered the steak frite and pretended to mispronounce the French names just to make me smile. It was about continuity. About placing one year beside another and seeing that love had survived both time and loss. Last year, at that same table, I gave him his father's watch. It was a plain watch by modern standards, gold-faced, leather band, a little worn near the clasp from decades on Thomas's wrist. David took it in both hands and did not speak for a moment. His eyes filled before mine did. "Are you sure?" he asked me. I told him yes, he was his father's son. David's wife, Meredith, came later into these traditions. She had her own family traditions, and I respected that from the beginning. At first, nothing was sharp enough to name. That is how these things happen. Not with a slammed door, but with a series of little hands quietly turning the lock. Over the 18 months before my birthday, Meredith began answering David's phone more often than he did. She was always pleasant. Too pleasant, sometimes. "He's tied up, Eleanor, but I'll tell him you called." Then the return call would not come until late evening, or the next day, if it came at all. David had once been careful about that. If he was busy, he said so. If he promised to call, he called. Suddenly there was always a meeting, a dead battery, some harmless confusion. Then came the account. He asked one Sunday afternoon over coffee if I would add his name to one of my savings accounts, just for emergencies, he said, in case I was ever hospitalized and bills needed paying. He said it gently, with concern arranged across his face so neatly that I nearly felt guilty for pausing. I signed the papers the next week. I trusted my son. That sounds foolish now. It did not feel foolish then. After that, I began hearing myself described in ways I did not recognize. At a family lunch, David mentioned my memory slips to my sister as if he were sharing weather. Meredith asked whether I had told my doctor about those episodes. I had no episodes. At Thanksgiving, David reminded me, in front of everyone, about an appointment I had never forgotten, then laughed and said, "See, Mom? This is what I mean." People smiled politely. I smiled too, because I could feel the trap in objecting too strongly. Meredith was subtler. She would look around my house and say things like, "Wouldn't you be happier somewhere smaller?" Less to manage, happier. That word came up often when they wanted me diminished. Each moment by itself was explainable. Concern can look a great deal like control if you hold it to the light long enough. I knew that. Still, my old instincts were awake now, sorting tone from fact, pattern from coincidence. Then, a week before my birthday, I called David to confirm our reservation. There was a pause on the line. Not long, just long enough. Then he said, "Let me check with Meredith." And something inside me went still before I understood why completely. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the laptop open and did what 40 years of hospital work had trained me to do when something felt wrong. I followed the money. The joint account showed 3 charges I had not made: a department store, a gas station 2 towns over. And then there it was, the restaurant bill from that evening, $418, posted to my account while my birthday cake sat untouched on the counter. My son had not just lied about being busy, he had used my money to fund the lie. I kept pulling. Credit card records, old statements I had filed and forgotten, a consultation fee paid 3 months earlier to a name I did not recognize at first. Gerald Forsyth, attorney at law. The charge came from my account, though I had never met the man. By morning, I had seen enough to suspect, but suspicion was not proof. I called Martin Chen. He had been my attorney for 20 years, a colleague first and a friend second. I told him what I had found. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Eleanor, I was hoping you would call me before they did." He told me that David and Meredith had contacted his office 2 weeks earlier, asking about conservatorship procedures. They had described my confusion, my declining memory, my inability to manage my own affairs. They had used words like wandering and episodes. Martin had declined to help them. But someone else had not. My hands were shaking when I hung up. Not from frailty, from recognition. I had seen this before. In the hospital, families would sometimes move like this against their own, a parent with assets, a child with patience and a story. Small lies told often enough that everyone starts to believe them. I knew the playbook. And now I knew they were running it on me. I sat with what I knew for a full day. The papers spread across my dining room table. The laptop still open. The silence of a house where I had once believed I was safe. My first instinct was to call David, to demand an explanation, to let him hear exactly how much I had discovered and watch him try to talk his way out of it. Confrontation felt clean. It felt honest. But I had spent 40 years watching confrontations fail. People deny. They destroy records. They reframe the story until you start to doubt what you saw with your own eyes. If I called David now, he would know I was awake, and the paperwork would disappear before I could blink. Instead, I called my sister. Margot had been a paralegal for 30 years before she retired, and she still thought like one. I laid everything out for her, the charges, the consultation fee, Martin's warning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do not say a word to him." She was furious. I could hear it beneath the calm. But Margot had always been the focused one. "Change nothing visible," she told me. "Let him keep thinking you are exactly who he has been describing. Confused, declining, easy to manage." She paused. "Let him build his own trap." That afternoon, I made a doctor's appointment. Not because I was worried about my mind. My mind was sharper than it had been in years. I made the appointment because I would need an official, dated cognitive evaluation when the time came. Documentation they could not explain away. Sitting there, phone still in my hand, I felt something shift. I was no longer the victim waiting to be rescued. I was the auditor now. The next 2 months were the longest performance of my life. I became the woman they had invented, scattered, slow, easily confused. When David visited, I asked where I had put my keys even though they were in my pocket. I hesitated over dates. I let sentences trail off mid-thought and watched him exchange glances with Meredith as if I could not see. And I saw everything. When Meredith repeated something she had already told me, I did not correct her. I nodded and thanked her for reminding me. When David offered to help with my bank statements, I slid them across the table with shaking hands I did not actually have. He explained charges I already understood, smoothing over the ones that led back to him with the ease of someone who had practiced. I let him lie, and I wrote it all down. Every evening after they left, I sat with Margot and documented. Time-stamped notes, screenshots, recorded phone calls, legal in my state with one-party consent. I built a file thicker than anything I had ever assembled at the hospital, and I kept it locked in Margot's house where no one would think to look. Then I asked David for copies of the conservatorship paperwork. I framed it gently. I told him I just wanted to understand what was happening. He smiled at me the way you smile at a child who has asked a question too big for them and handed over the documents without hesitation. Smug. Certain. A week later, he brought the estate lawyer to my home. Gerald Forsythe sat in my living room with his folder open while I served tea and nodded along. Margot was in the next room with a baby monitor turned on, recording every word. Forsythe explained the process slowly, pausing often, as if I might lose the thread. Then he said, "Once the filing goes through, you won't have to worry about any of this. Mrs. Ashford, David will handle everything." I looked at my son. He was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, watching me with something that looked almost like pity. I smiled at both of them. "That's such a relief," I said. And I meant it, though not in the way they believed. The relief was knowing that every word had been captured, every lie, every condescending pause. They left that evening satisfied, shaking hands at the door, already dividing up a life that was not theirs to take. They had no idea what was coming. One chose my venue carefully. Not a family gathering. Not a private phone call where words could be denied or softened later. I waited for the conservatorship hearing itself. If they wanted to make this legal, then legal is where I would end it. David and Meredith arrived at the courthouse looking polished, confident. Meredith had worn the pearl earrings I gave her at their wedding. David adjusted his tie in the hallway and nodded at Gerald Forsythe as if this were already finished. A formality, a signature away from control. Then I walked in. I had Margot beside me, Martin Chen behind me, and in my hands, a binder thick enough to land with a sound when I set it on the table. The judge looked at me the way people had been looking at me for months. Patient, gentle, ready to guide a confused old woman through something she could not possibly understand. She asked if I understood the nature of these proceedings. I stood. "Your Honor," I said, "I understand them better than the petitioners do." Then I opened the binder. The cognitive evaluation came first. Dated, signed, unambiguous. Full mental capacity, no signs of impairment. Then the financial records. Unauthorized charges. Account access I had not approved. Consultation fees for the very lawyer sitting across from me, billed to my own credit card without my knowledge. David leaned forward. "Mom, you're confused." This is exactly what we were worried about. I did not look at him. Instead, I nodded to Martin, and he pressed play. David's voice filled the courtroom, recorded in my living room 3 weeks earlier. Clear, casual, unguarded. She won't even remember signing the papers by next week. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Meredith's face drain of color. I watched Gerald Forsythe step slightly back from the table, distancing himself from his own clients. I watched David open his mouth and find nothing there. The judge's expression had changed entirely. I turned, finally, and looked at my son. "I was never confused," I said. "I was watching." The petition was denied that morning, and not gently. The judge dismissed it with prejudice, which meant they could not simply tidy up their paperwork and try again. She referred both David and Meredith for investigation into possible elder financial abuse, and she ordered a review of the account activity we had submitted. You could almost hear the room change around them. All that practiced concern vanished the moment consequences became real. I spent the rest of that week doing what should have been done sooner. I removed David from every account, closed the joint one entirely, changed my online access, my passwords, my emergency contacts, and then, with Martin sitting across from me, I changed my will, cleanly, legally, permanently. David called 11 times in 2 days. The messages moved in circles, first apologies, then explanations, then anger. He said Meredith had pushed too hard. He said he was only trying to protect me. He said I had embarrassed him. I did not answer a single call. What surprised me was Meredith's family. They began calling me directly, careful, and unsettled because they had been told I was declining rapidly. Now they understood what had really happened. Gerald Forsyth received a bar complaint from Martin's office. By Friday, every door they had tried to close around me had opened instead, one by one, under official hands. David's last text came just before midnight. "You've destroyed this family." I read it once, set down the phone, and blocked his number. 6 months later, I moved, not to somewhere smaller, to a cottage 10 minutes from Margot, with a garden I had no excuse not to tend. Last Sunday, we ate dinner together, just the two of us, with a decent glass of wine and enough quiet to hear the birds outside. It was enough. It was more than enough. On my mantel sits Thomas's watch. The sheriff retrieved it during the investigation. I did not ask for much. I asked for that. I want to say something directly to you now. I did not raise my son to be cruel, but I raised myself to pay attention. Love is not a reason to let someone take your life from you. And the people who tell you that you are confused, they are usually counting on it. If this story belongs to someone you know, please share it with them. If it moved you, like and subscribe. Sometimes the strongest thing a mother can do is stop pretending she doesn't see.